Hello, and welcome to the 12th episode of A Woman Robbed, a bonus series from And the Runner Up Is, where we talk about actresses who may have come close to earning Oscar nominations, but were ultimately overlooked or omitted, or for one reason or another, just did not have the votes to make it into the final lineup, and discussing why they may have deserved to get in and why they ultimately did not. And each episode has its own theme, presented as a double feature. And this week, we're going to be covering two performances that won the Independent Spirit Award for Best Female Lead, but weren't even nominated at the Oscars. And joining me today to help me break them down is one of my favorite people to talk about film with, personally. He's done two Best Actress episodes with me, discussing the lineups of 1944 and 1976. Welcome back, Zach Laws.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be on here for the what number is this at
God only
between
knows. 15.
yeah, yeah, right. I've got to be like in the area where you can like give me a jacket, you know,
Yeah.
for
You're at least in the 10 timers club, I think. So congrats, I suppose.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're working on a jacket as we speak.
I'm glad to
Um,
hear it. Yeah. If you need my
yes.
measurements, just ask. So
Okay, great. Great. Well, yeah, let's get right into it. So I presented to my patrons here, and the runner-up is a list of 10 women who won the Independent Spirit Award for Best Female Lead, but weren't nominated at the Oscars. So just to recap the choices, they were Isabella Rossellini in Blue Velvet, Jodie Foster in Five Quarters, Andie MacDowell in Sex, Lies, and Videotape, Judy Davis in Impromptu, Fairuza Balk in Guest Food Lodging, Ashley Judd in Ruby in Paradise, Linda Fiorentino in The Last Seduction, Ali Sheedy in High Art, Sharika Epps in Half Nelson, and Taylor Page in Zola. And the top vote getters there were Isabella Rossellini and Linda Fiorentino. So those are who we'll be talking about today. The next closest was Andie MacDowell, just for transparency's sake, which I have to be honest, I'm a little bit relieved that she wasn't chosen, at least for now, because I just talked about Sex, Lies, and Videotape on How Did They Win a few months ago. So just glad I don't have to repeat myself too soon. Would still be interested in discussing that performance down the line, though.
well, it's interesting that these were the top two vote getters, and also I'd
Yes,
say that it's interesting that Andie MacDowell was the number three because there is like a common theme
there
with
sure is.
Florentino and Rossellini.
Oh,
Um,
yes.
so yeah, I mean, I guess it says something about your listenership that they were in the mood to talk
Yeah.
about these two performances.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Well, before we discuss these two performances here, Zach, I wanted to just talk about if you had any thoughts on, the Independent Spirit Awards themselves and maybe its relationship with the Oscars and how maybe that's changed over the years. Just any introductory thoughts on the Indie Spirits.
Yeah, so I think when we're talking about these two Best Actress winners at the Independent Spirit Awards, and the fact that both were not nominated at the Oscars, and in fact, like that list you were reading off there,
Mm-hmm.
it really indicates just how different the Independent Spirit Awards were back then. Because there, especially like in the early years of the ceremony, this was during like the independent film boom, right? It's like post the 1970s new Hollywood revolution. We're right in the blockbuster obsessed big studio era. And the independent cinema of the mid 80s throughout the late 90s and early 2000s is really where you're seeing the tradition of the 1970s continue onward. And it's striking that in the early years of it, there was very little overlap with the Academy Awards. And yet, you had movies like Blood Simple from the Coen brothers, After Hours from Scorsese, Blue Velvet, obviously, these movies that have had lasting legacies in spite of the fact that they weren't favored by the Academy Awards by and large. That's really started to change quite a bit. And I feel like, two of the things that have happened is number one, I think there needs to be kind of a stricter budget cap on what constitutes an independent film these days because it seems to be kind of like more concerned with becoming an Academy Awards precursor than an actual celebration of independent cinema. And that also has to do with the fact that the membership has opened up quite a bit. It's like any one of us could join Film Independent for, I think it's like $100 a year or
Yep.
something like that, and
Yeah.
become a voting member. And that's not to disparage anybody who does the voting, but I do think that there's something, and like, and all the time that I've been writing about the Academy Awards, which was going back to 2012, it's really become obvious that they're more concerned with rewarding whoever is Oscar nominated or whoever is like in the running for an Oscar than they are with, celebrating real independent cinema.
Yes, we are very much on the same wavelength with this. I mean, I really like the Independent Spirit Awards. I think they're one of the more valuable awards out there.
Mm.
And I think it gets a little annoying when they are just seen as a precursor, because to me, I've always seen them as like the one prominent, I guess, televised film award that has some value outside of the horse race of the Oscars.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, to me, it is that recognition of films and performances that don't always have the benefit of the huge studio backing and do riskier things and are employing actors who aren't the A-listers necessarily, or if they are, they're in these productions that are just more interested in telling this very real, human stories more often than not. And yeah, I think it is unfortunate that the 2010s, I think, kind of is where it turned,
Yeah.
they really started to align with the Oscars a lot. But maybe part of that is just that, like, those more meaningful or daring kinds of stories started to really go away in terms of the mainstream over time. So Oscar voters almost didn't have much choice but to like go for those smaller films, maybe. But I think it's just important to establish that the independent spirits are very much existing as their own thing, especially with the two performances we're talking about today. And yeah, just to bring it back to what you were saying, I feel like I mentioned this on every episode of A Woman Rob, but once again, the patrons really have chosen a fantastic double feature in how we have these two femme fatale roles, but kind of like a spin on the classic film noir kind of femme fatale thing, and doing
Mm-hmm.
some unexpected things with those tropes, I guess. And I also wanted to note for you, Zach, just because our first Best Actress episode, we discussed Isabella's mother, Ingrid
Yes.
Bergman,
Yeah.
you know, and we also discussed one of the great femme fatale roles of all time, Barbara Stanwyck in Double Indemnity. So yeah, those were some of the reasons I wanted to have you back on to continue that theme a bit.
I was thinking about that when I was watching both of these movies. I was like,
Yeah.
it's going to be similar territory for me to talk
Yeah.
about.
Yeah, you're my film noir expert, I guess.
I'll take it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, let's jump right into it. Starting off first with Isabella Rossellini in Blue Velvet.
Jeffrey Beaumont? What are you doing in my apartment, Jeffrey Beaumont?
I wanted to see you.
Are you kidding? Who sent you here?
Nobody.
I've seen you before.
I sprayed your apartment. I took your key. I didn't mean to do anything except see you.
What did you see tonight? Tell me.
I saw you come in. I saw you talk on the phone.
And then?
We got undressed.
Do you sneak in girls' apartment to see them get undressed?
No, never before this.
Okay, so Isabella Rossellini comes from a very noble lineage, as I said, in the film world, daughter of Ingrid Bergman and Roberto Rossellini. So not bad parents to have. She was born
Nepo
in
baby.
Rome, but very much so. Yeah. she eventually gets into modeling before acting, and she has a thriving career there. She was a spokesmodel for Lacombe. She was in only a handful of films before Blue Velvet, including A Matter of Time, The Meadow, and In the Pope's Eye. And then her first American film is White Nights in 1985, just a year before Blue Velvet. So as far as her casting, David Lynch had attached Helen Mirren at first in the role, but she dropped out eventually. And then he met Isabella at a restaurant and kind of commented on how she looks so much like Ingrid Bergman, and had no idea apparently that she was her mother, and just offered her the part. And it was also, I guess, maybe worth mentioning, a start of a romantic relationship. So they were very connected. They were together from 86 to 91. But Blue Velvet is about a young, inquisitive young college student, Jeffrey, played by Kyle MacLachlan, who discovers a severed ear while out walking, and he decides to investigate. So he brings it to the police and learns from the police detective's daughter, Sandy, played by Laura Dern, that it may have to do with a nightclub singer named Dorothy Valens, played by Isabella. So Jeffrey takes it upon himself to investigate and goes to her apartment, posing as an exterminator at first, but then he comes back and hides in her closet, and she ends up spotting him and threatens him at first, but soon is developing a sort of kinship with him. But then Jeffrey is soon in over his head as he sees how Dorothy is involved with this abusive drug dealer, Frank, played by Dennis Hopper, and finds himself exposed to a very dark criminal conspiracy. So let's talk Isabella Rossellini and Blue Velvet. Zach, I know that you are huge fan of this film, but would love for you to talk about your experience with the film and just Isabella Rossellini overall and her performance here.
Yeah, so we've talked about many of my favorite movies over the, I don't know, decade of us of you doing this podcast, however long it's been.
Yeah.
This film is very comfortably in my top 5 of all time.
Wow.
At least it's in my Letterboxd 4 for whatever that means.
Top 4. Okay.
Yeah. I remember I saw this movie for the first time when I was around 13 or 14, and I'm able to place it at that because my first awareness of this movie was I was watching one of those AFI 100 Years specials that they used
Classic.
to do.
We used to be a proper country.
I know, right? Yeah. Like film Twitter generations today don't know what they're missing out on when you could see on primetime television a special about 100 years, 100 heroes and villains. And one of the villains that they selected was Frank Booth from Blue Velvet.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously they were limited in what scenes they could show of Frank Booth on this primetime network television special.
Yeah.
But the scene that they did show was so striking to me that it made me sit up and go like, well, I want to see this movie, right? Because that was the way that I discovered a lot of films back then was, it was either like AFI specials or it was watching Ebert and Roper or, just browsing the video store and seeing something that caught my eye. And I saw this movie and it just immediately imprinted on me. And I saw everything. It was like my introduction to David Lynch. It was my introduction to Isabella Rossellini. And from there, I saw everything that I could of David Lynch's. And this is like before streaming, before all of his movies were even on DVD. So I was like watching Wild at Heart on VHS and, getting like VHS tapes of Twin Peaks episodes to see them that way. And I realized I responded to David Lynch on this rewatch. I was thinking about why it is that I responded to this movie so powerfully. And I realized it was for the same reason that I responded to the works of like John Waters. There are these guys who were raised in the 1950s and early 1960s, grew up in small town America, conservative, rock rib Republican households, and very much like I did in the 90s and early 2000s, growing up in North Carolina, church-going family. North Carolina, where this movie was shot, by the way.
There you go. Yep.
And when I saw Blue Velvet, or I saw Polyester, or saw any number of these movies that are of a similar vein, I think it made me realize, like, oh, I'm not the only one who's uncomfortable by this.
Right.
I'm not the only person. Exactly. Yeah. I'm not the only one who's weirded out by this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, this movie had such an impact on me that, like, when I was in film school, that one of the first movies I made as a freshman was centered on this woman with black hair wearing a blue bathrobe. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't like I consciously set out to mimic Blue Velvet. It was just kind of like, well, that's what I see in my head.
Right.
And it, like watching it again recently, I was like, well, obviously, yeah, because like that was such a huge thing for me. And Rossellini, again, like this is the first thing I'd ever seen her in. I've obviously seen her in a lot of other things since then, not just David Lynch movies. You mentioned that this was basically her second American film,
Mm-hmm.
and that Helen Mirren was originally Lynch's first choice. I think anybody who knows Helen Mirren today would be surprised to hear
Yeah.
that. But Helen Mirren back then, like during the Cook, the Thief, His Wife and Her Lover kind of days,
Mm-hmm.
makes perfect sense for this role. And I was thinking about what the movie would have been like with Helen Mirren instead of Isabella Rossellini. I think Helen Mirren would have been very good in the role, but it would have been a different kind of characterization than what Rossellini does. Because, Helen Mirren would have brought a lot more experience, acting experience. I think a lot more of an edge, perhaps. There's something to Rossellini's lack of training that makes her really perfect for this role, because there's a vulnerability there. There's a willingness to expose yourself both literally and metaphorically, because a lot of the things that Dorothy Valens goes through in this movie, a lot of the things that she's asked to convey are really raw and uncomfortable. And they're places that a lot of more experienced actresses might be unwilling to go to, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think all of these things combine to make Dorothy an interesting kind of take on the femme fatale, right? Which is we talked about this with Barbara Stanwyck in Double Indemnity, where it's she is so hard edged and she is so cynical. And I think that's kind of what Helen Mirren would have been like if she'd gotten this role. But I think that Rossellini's real vulnerability is what makes this character so interesting to watch and engenders so much empathy for her from me. And so it's I'm always going to associate her with Dorothy Valens, because I think it speaks to who Rossellini probably is as a person. Very glamorous, beautiful individual, originally known for her looks primarily because she was a
Mm-hmm.
former model, but with something else kind of underneath that is much deeper and darker and more fascinating.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that actually. I really enjoy Isabella. I think she obviously had such huge shoes to fill in the shadow of her mother, and it's really so eerie sometimes to watch her in this and other films, and it truly does feel like you're watching Ingrid Bergman kind of in her youth. Just the resemblance I think is so striking. And yeah, this character of Dorothy I think makes great use of her physicality, her beauty, but also just the sort of tortured nature of how she interacts with the world. And I think she just fits it so perfectly, not only for those surface level femme fatale, dark hair qualities that Lynch is obviously leaning into, but also in showing how she can't really be summed up either. Because for as easy as it can be to, put her into the femme fatale role or like the damsel in distress or whatever trope you want to assign her, the way that she plays this character and the way she's written, I do think is more complex than that. Because yes, she has this brutal life as she's beaten up by Frank, but she also seems to take a little bit of pleasure in it too at times, or at least she's come to a place of accepting that this is what she wants, or that this is kind of just for her own survival, maybe. But I think kind of the point is that we don't know, and we don't ever fully know, I don't think, because it's almost entirely through Jeffrey's eyes that we're seeing her. It's like he's trying to fill this role of, being her one true savior or friend from these bad men. But those moments where she tells him to hit her and is sort of going between that violence and that tenderness, she's just so unknowable and unpredictable. And again, it's not made clear to the audience why she's expressing herself in that way. And I do think that is kind of speaking to the broader point that Lynch is trying to go for, which is how the real world, I think, can be so strange and unfathomable almost at times. Like Jeffrey even says very famously at one point, how can men like Frank exist in the world?
Mm-hmm.
And there's this sort of blending of the reality and that dreamlike quality that's become obviously Lynch's trademark, really, for where not everything should be interpreted with hard logic, and I think that's kind of where she exists, in that dreamlike state.
It's fascinating because I was rewatching the movie this time, I'm focusing on Rossellini's performance a lot because that's what we're here to talk about. But I also was watching what Laura Dern did as Sandy. And I'm more freaked out by Sandy than I am by Dorothy. Just because, like, I mean, I've known women like Sandy. I grew up around women like Sandy. I've dated women like Sandy. It's really, I don't know how to respond to people like Sandy, either women or men for that matter, who are so sheltered and blinded from the realities of life and don't want to deal with the fact that life can be dark and life can be cruel and life can be surreal at times. Like you see the way that she like reacts to seeing Dorothy in the very famous scene where she's naked on Jeffrey's lawn and has obviously been beaten up. She just like, she retreats, into like asking like, where are my robins? Where's my dream of hope? And she's like, I thought it was so interesting that like she's sitting next to a poster of Montgomery Cliff on her wall, a man who like had this very like private, life that he kept hidden from everyone because of the realities of the time that he grew up in. And I think it speaks to the fact that like Jeffrey retreats into a life with Sandy when he's like seeing too much of the real world, and I think that he's kind of trying to turn Dorothy into a version of Sandy, right? Where it's like, if I can just save this woman from herself, then I can have her and I can have all of the pleasures that go along with her, but I won't have to worry about the complications of her life, right? I think that a lesser film would have made it very clear that, she's afraid of Frank or that she doesn't like what's going on, but it's a much more interesting film because of the fact that it is exploring the twisted link between sex and violence that this woman lives in. And the fact that like things are not always as clean cut and crystal clear as 1950s and early 60s America would have you believe it.
Right. Thank you for listening to this preview of A Woman Robbed, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is. If you liked what you heard and want to hear more, please go to patreon.com/andtherunnerupis and become a patron. Only $3 a month will get you access to bonus episodes and early access to regular episodes. Thank you so much for your consideration.